Hello and welcome to another installment of Conservation Conversations with BirdLife South Africa. I'm your host, Melissa Howes-Whitecross, and for those of you tuning in for the first time, here's a quick Zoom 101. To communicate with the speakers, please type your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You, the audience, will also be able to upvote these questions and make sure that the ones that you'd like to be answered most receive a high number of votes so that we can see them at the top of the screen. We'll tackle all the questions at the end of the talks, but if you do have a question during the talk, you can pop it in while the speaker is speaking, and we'll get those at the end. I'd like to welcome those of you tuning in through Facebook Live tonight as well. If you have any questions, please type them into the comment feed, and we'll answer them at the end of the talk as well. I'd like to also say a big thank you to all of you who supported us through the cricket donations last week. We had a number of really generous donations, and all of these go a long way to helping us produce these webinars each week. Your support allows us to keep giving conservation wings and bringing you these weekly webinars. I'd also like to extend a special welcome to all of our Conservation League donors tuning in tonight. Conservation League donors are BirdLife South Africa members who donate an additional 2,800 Rand on top of their standard BirdLife membership. This donation qualifies for Section 18A tax certificate and provides BirdLife with important unencumbered funds that allow us to do the important conservation work that we need to get done. BirdLife currently has approximately 130 Conservation League donors, and we'd like to get to approximately 200 this year. If you sign up before 31 August 2020, you could win a pair of Zeiss Conquest HD 10x42 binoculars. Now, I can personally vouch for these binoculars as they're the pair that I get to use in the field, and these were kindly sponsored by Zeiss. And you can see a number of our conservation and BirdLife staff there who have also been sponsored by Zeiss. They are a really great optics company, and we're very grateful to them for this support. So please consider signing up for our Conservation League donor membership. You can find out all the details you need to on our website, www.birdlife.org.za. I'd also like to remind all of you to try your luck with the BirdLife South Africa's jackpot birding. And this is where you could win yourself a 100,000 Rand cash prize for the mere price of just 500 Rand a ticket. This was meant to be a birding trip to Brazil, but unfortunately due to COVID, we've shifted the prize to a cash prize. And we hope that many of you will sign up for this on our website as well. Now this evening we're in for a very exciting webinar. Dr. Hanneline Smit-Robinson, BirdLife South Africa's Head of Conservation, will be presenting an overview of BirdLife South Africa's conservation work, and she will be joined by two of BirdLife South Africa's senior staff. Daniel Manovic is the manager of the Regional Conservation Program, and Alistair McInnes is the manager of our Seabird Conservation Program. Both of these gentlemen are leaders in their fields, and we're very excited to have their input on this webinar this evening. Now, Dr. Hanneline Smit-Robinson has been with BirdLife South Africa for approximately 9 years, and she's been the spearhead for all of our conservation work on the most threatened terrestrial birds in South Africa. Hanneline headed up the Terrestrial Bird Conservation Program for the last 9 years and was recently promoted to Head of Conservation during last year. With her important role as Head of Conservation, Hanneline is able to guide all of BirdLife South Africa's conservation work, and she'll be sharing some of the important steps she's put in place to help guide our conservation program going forward. Hanneline is also an avid birder and a very keen naturalist and loves to spend time in the outdoors with her family. I'd like to welcome Hanneline, Daniel, and Alistair, and I'm going to hand over to Hanneline to share her screen with you all before we start this presentation. Thank you guys for joining us this evening.
Hi everyone, and a very warm welcome here from Fairland in Johannesburg. And thanks also to Daniel and to Alistair joining me tonight on this webinar. So Alistair is based in Cape Town and Daniel's also based here in Joburg. So before I start, I thought I'd love to just share something personal with all of you. In 2 weeks' time, I would have been with BirdLife South Africa for 10 years, and it's really been such a rewarding time, not working on all the conservation projects, but also being part of the BirdLife family. And when I say BirdLife family, it's not only the BirdLife family here in South Africa, but also extended family across the world. So we have partners in more than 100 countries across the world. or belonging to BirdLife International. And we share our mission. So BirdLife South Africa's mission is the same as that of BirdLife International. And that is to strive to conserve birds, their habitats and biodiversity through scientifically based programs, through supporting the sustainable and equitable use of natural resources, by encouraging people to enjoy and value nature. So we're hoping to use video. I know that there's been a couple of requests to use video, but unfortunately we didn't manage so tonight. So just bear with us as we're just talking without our videos on. The presentation that I'm going to be giving to you, I'm going to first focus on the relevance of the conservation sector, particularly in this ever-changing world that we're living in, and what does that mean for BirdLife South Africa's conservation strategy. Then I will introduce to you the structure of our conservation division, and then we'll go on to the more fun part, and we'll look at the highlights of a number of our conservation projects within these programs. So our strategy is aligned with that of BirdLife International. So BirdLife International has got 9 programs, and our conservation strategy, as I said, is aligned to those programs, which is climate change, forests of hope, sites and habitat conservation, invasive alien species, local engagement and empowerment, the marine or the Seabirds program, migratory birds and flyways, preventing extinction or protecting our species, and then finally empowering people through capacity development as well. So moving on from there, I think it would be wrong to talk about relevance without mentioning COVID-19. So at the time that we were setting up our conservation strategy, we had no idea that this world would be hit by a global pandemic. And I'm not only referring to a relevance in terms of the global wildlife trade, but also in terms of healthy ecosystems. If we have more intact, non-fragmented habitats that's managed correctly, it means that the actual spread of these pandemics would be slowed down. And our mother organization, BirdLife International, challenged the United Nations just a couple of weeks ago, saying that it's a human right to have access to a healthy natural environment. So that's really our relevance within the conservation sector, and our relevance is more important than ever before. And I've also heard many economists saying that ecology might become the new economy. So just running through these slides in terms of the relevance of the conservation sector, our BirdLife South Africa's conservation strategy is aligned with global priorities. I think you're all aware that before COVID-19, much of the conservation talk was about climate change and the impacts of, and we think back on climate marches that took place last year. So the Paris Agreement specifically is an agreement that many of the emitting countries actually belong to, and where they agree to reduce their carbon emissions to the point that there will be less than 2-degree increase in temperature within the century. Unfortunately, we're way off this mark, but there's always hope and there's lots of opportunities. So 2020 at the start of a new century is a big year for conservation. Unfortunately, through this pandemic, many of our international meetings will be postponed to next year, but important decisions will be taken at those meetings, such as those of the Convention on Biological Diversity, as well as the IUCN World Conservation Congress. And we're not only aligning our priorities, we're also contributing. So some of our staff members will be at those meetings and will contribute and participate to those decisions that will underpin conservation for the next 10 years. And also just to mention the IUCN again, so we had an IUCN members meetings directly with Minister Barbara Creasy, Department of Environment, last Friday, where we engaged on all of these relevant topics. So talking about our local Department of Environment, let's look at what's happening here in South Africa. So we are aligning ourselves with national priorities, policy and legislation. And underpinned by that is definitely our Biodiversity Act, as well as our Protected Areas Act. And then directly flowing from that is also our National Protected Areas Expansion Strategy. We also have a National Development Plan that speaks specifically to social inequalities and job opportunities. And BirdLife South Africa is specifically looking at how we can contribute, and we can contribute in various ways to the green or the wildlife economy, creating more job opportunities. And that is our social contribution apart from our environmental contribution. Then we have an important publication, and you can see that on the slide listed here, the National Biodiversity Assessment that was published by the South African National Biodiversity Institute in 2018. This publication talks about the status of South Africa's ecosystems and biodiversity. And I'm very proud to say that BirdLife South Africa's scientists and conservationists contributed and collated the bird data that went into this report. The report also highlights some of the areas that needs attention and that's most threatened. So freshwater ecosystems, for example, is particularly threatened. And here I'm just mentioning one bird, the black stork, that's so reliable on fresh water, clean river streams for its foraging. So now still back at home, looking at what are those burning, pertinent, current and future conservation issues and how do we fit in? So our conservation strategy is to identify those core climate resilient areas so that we can limit the habitat fragmentation, that we can implement habitat protection, that we can help to do ecological restoration in those areas, also protect our strategic water source or our fresh water source areas, and then contribute to the green or the wildlife economy through creating those job opportunities. And also through those opportunities, safeguard our conservation investments. So what you'll see here is also another slide talking to the financial investment of the Department of Environment last year, so the actual budget vote. And you can see that the actual monetary values that's been contributed to protected areas management, as well as to biodiversity economy and sustainable development. So with that behind us, we've got a photo of the team, a team of conservationists. So this is our conservation division. And BirdLife South Africa has got so many positives, but I think this is one of our extreme positives. We have a skilled, passionate, dedicated team of staff. And we also realize that we can't do this work on our own. So we're reliant on strategic partnerships to deliver and to achieve our goals. So those partnerships, so I've got a photo that's taken last year. It was the meeting that we held in Zimbabwe with all the partners, BirdLife partners in Southern Africa. So together we are stronger as a family. But we also recognize our partnerships with other organizations, in particular with our national department. So here's two of our colleagues with Minister Creasy at a social event. And not only with national department, but also with like-minded organizations, such as the Endangered Wildlife Trust, WWF, the Mabula Ground Hornbill Project, and also strong strategic partnerships with academic institutions such as the Fitzpatrick Institute for Ornithology. Apart from this environmental investment, we also have good governance, and that's another positive for BirdLife South Africa. And our governance is not only around good financial governance, but also all our processes and also our ethics in terms of undertaking our conservation work. So we have a BirdLife South Africa Ethics Committee, and this is chaired, and the members serving on those ethics committee are all independent from our organization. So now I'd like to translate all the relevance and our conservation strategy and how to achieve our success into a physical structure. So this is a structure of our conservation division. And this structure has been in place since the 1st of January this year. So we underwent a restructuring process late last year. And we have 4 main conservation programs. The first being the Seabird conservation program. And then we have landscape conservation. So landscape conservation combines our species and our sites work within South Africa. So we have 2 sub-programs there, protecting ecosystems and protecting species. And then quite an exciting new program, Empowering People, as you would remember, aligned with BirdLife International's Empowering People program. And this is specifically where we're hoping to make a big contribution to the green economy, looking at opportunities specifically around education, so community education, and also the training of our community bird guides and other aviatourism projects. And then there's another new program, regional conservation. So we've always been involved in conservation projects throughout Africa, also specifically in Southern Africa, where we've been supporting our partners. But this new full program gives us the opportunity, with the support of the Royal Society for Protection of Birds, to reach out and to capacitate and also to look at opportunities to support partners throughout Africa. Then those 4 main programs are supported by our other 2 programs. So those cross-cutting programs are science and innovation and policy and advocacy. I'd also like to share with you some of our successful and publications. So Martin Taylor was the first author of this publication on the state of South Africa's birds. And this talks specifically to the threats and to the status of our birds, and it's linked directly to 2 of our other prominent publications, both being published in 2015. The first being on the Eskom Red Data Book of Birds of the region of South Africa, Lesotho and Swaziland, and then also important bird and biodiversity areas directory, of which Daniel was the first author. And we've got 113 IBAs in South Africa, 13,500 of those worldwide. And those are all areas of global significance for the conservation of our bird species. So if we zoom in on specifically the Red Data Book and what we see in terms of our threatened bird species, we've got 132 threatened bird species in South Africa. So the totals that you see there, the 85 speak specifically to those in the categories of critically endangered, endangered and vulnerable, plus a 47 near threatened species. And what is of concern is that 45 of that 132 species are actually our seabird species. So this is the group of species that's shown the most remarkable decline since the publication of our last Red Data Book in 2000. And we've had incredible success in terms of some of our seabird conservation work, specifically the reduction of mortalities of albatrosses and petrels, a 99% reduction in mortality rate through mitigation measures that's been implemented in terms of the bycatch of longline and trawl fishing. If we're back on the land bird side, the most threatened groups are raptors, as well as our large terrestrial birds, and then also some other species, specifically also those linked to our freshwater ecosystems. So I'm now going to hand over to Alistair to talk to you about some of our conservation successes in the Seabird Conservation Program, and then I'll join you a little bit later again.
Thanks, Hanneline, and good evening, everyone. Yeah, I'm just going to talk just a short slot on just summing up some of our core projects that we're involved in. Hanneline, you can move to the next slide. A lot of our core projects are basically centered around well-known key threats to seabirds, and we have prioritized a lot of our projects in the past and currently around addressing some of these key threats. So Hanneline, if you can move to the next slide again. So basically what we're looking at here is basically two relatively recent reviews of global threats to seabirds, one in 2012 by John Croxall, and then one more recently last year by Maria Dyers in 2019. Basically, sorry, Hanneline, if you can just go back. A lot of our core projects are actually centered around two of those largest threats, alien invasive species, especially with seabirds breeding on colonies such as Marion Island, and then seabird bycatch mitigation, which Hanneline did mention briefly. A big issue for especially our coastal endemic Benguela seabird species is that relates to overfishing and resource competition. So if you can go into the next slide, please, Hanneline. Just to sum up those core projects, broadly they're divided into our pelagic seabird species. If you can go to the next prompt there, Hanneline, which are offshore species, mostly albatrosses and petrels are the ones that are mostly threatened there. And then if you can go to the next animation, Hanneline, and coastal seabird species, with most of our threatened seabird species focused around the Benguela endemics. So one of the core projects, as Hanneline mentioned, for pelagic offshore species is bycatch mitigation, and that's headed up by the Albatross Task Force that's been going for quite some time. We've got 2 staff members there, Andrea Angel and Reason Nyangera, and that division has a really good track record of success, as Hanneline mentioned, with greater than 95% reduction in bycatch of albatrosses and petrels in the trawl fishery. Another core project more related to pelagic seabirds, and something that's quite new to the division, is that of island restoration, specifically the eradication of invasive mice from 2 core islands that South Africa is involved in, Goth Island and Marion Island. So we have one staff member, Nini van der Merwe, who's really involved and plays a really big support role to the Royal Society for Protection of Birds, who are actively involved and are the leaders currently in that eradication. Moving down to coastal seabirds, the next prompt, thanks Hanneline. Christina Hagen gave a really interesting talk the other day in Conservation Conversations about her project down at De Hoop. And this is quite a novel, unique and ambitious project to create a new African penguin colony in between their core breeding range and where we know there are lots of bait fish that are available and less competition by fisheries. So if you want to go into more detail about that project, I suggest you look at the recording on YouTube. And a key focus of the coastal seabird work is also advocating an ecosystem approach to fisheries with government. So the majority, 4 out of the 5 of our endangered seabird species all eat the same bait fish, which is the bountiful bait fish in the Benguela ecosystem. And we have long involvement with fisheries and engaging with them to basically incorporate concerns of non-target fish species into the management procedure. So I'm going to actually talk a little bit more about African penguins now, because a lot of these other focuses will have dedicated talks for them. So Hanneline, if you can move to the next slide. So African penguins are clearly a big focus of the Seabird program. Not only are they Africa's only penguin species, very charismatic and popular species, but their conservation status is very worrying. So their population has decreased by greater than 70% since the turn of the century. And before the 20th century, these birds were in the millions. Sorry, if you can go back a bit. So what are the actual drivers of the decline in the species? As with the other Benguela endemics, Cape cormorants and Cape gannets, it's the availability of their prey that seems to come up over and over again as highly correlated with their population level. So we're currently involved in an island closure experiment to gauge the response of these birds to fishing around their breeding colonies. So we're hoping to see some results of that later this year. But a more novel aspect that we're looking at, if you can move forward, Hanneline, to the next slide, is looking at how we can incorporate conservation measures into their non-breeding distribution. And this is pre and post molt. So just after they breed and just after they molt. And as you can see by this map, their distribution expands quite significantly outside of the breeding season, when they're only limited to 40 kilometers around their colonies, to up to hundreds of kilometers further south and north. So we're hoping, together with the breeding colony work and the non-breeding work, ultimately we're trying to save those foraging hotspots and regulate them in terms of resource competition and protection against other threats, to hopefully secure this species and other Benguela endemics into the future. And I'll be talking in a more dedicated talk in another episode of Conservation Conversations later on in July, more about just the interactions between baitfish and these Benguela endemics and the significance of this to conservation. Thanks, Hanneline. You can take over from now.
Thanks, and thanks, Alistair. Apologies, there seems to be an automated timer on some of those slides that moved a little bit faster than we wanted them to move. So we're now going to talk about our second conservation program, and this is a really big program, the Landscape Conservation Program. And I think the lady there on the far right, that's your host for these webinars, need no introduction. So Dr. Melissa House-Whitecross is the manager of this program. And there's two sub-programs, protecting ecosystems and protecting species. So particularly the threats that this program is addressing is the threats to our bird species in terms of habitat loss. And now we're talking not seabirds, but land birds. So habitat loss must be by far the biggest threat to all our bird species. Habitat alteration, degradation, fragmentation, and therefore the importance to protect the habitat of these threatened species. We're also dealing with the threat of climate change, and then we're dealing with species-specific threats such as pesticides, poisons, heavy metals, as well as collisions and also electrocutions with energy infrastructure. Now, we've got 132 threatened bird species, and how do we prioritize which of those bird species should we be focusing our efforts on? So we follow a prioritization protocol, which is objective in its criteria, and decide on which species and which groups of species we should be focusing. And unfortunately, I don't have time to highlight all of those species and groups, but I would like to highlight just a few groups. And the first is raptors. So about a quarter of our raptors, 22 of the 80 raptor species, are threatened. And those include specifically our vultures, so all obligate scavengers. And that also speaks to species such as the battalier and the tawny eagle. But we're also doing some raptor conservation projects on species that's more threatened by habitat loss and habitat and specifically land use change, such as the secretary bird, Taita falcon, and the southern banded snake eagle. So I'd like to spend just a little bit of time on vultures themselves. So vultures are an important part of our ecosystem. In Africa, they rid the veld of carcasses. And 8 of the 15 species of African Eurasian, or also known as Old World vultures, are listed as critically endangered. So we have 11 vulture species in Africa, of which 7 are nearing extinction, and 4 of South Africa's 9 vulture species are critically endangered, with only the palm nut vulture not being on the threatened list. So there's many threats to our vulture species, and those include specifically habitat loss and also loss of food. So just a decline in food availability, as well as also energy infrastructure. But I'd like to highlight here on the screen specifically poisoning. And we talk about intentional and unintentional poisoning. And I'm sure many of you are aware of the intentional poisoning threat through poaching. So carcasses of elephants and rhinos that's poached, that's loaded with poisons. And also harvesting for belief-based use. And then in terms of unintentional poisoning threats, we're talking about secondary poisoning for predator control. So would be specifically poisons for jackals as an example, where vultures get poisoned in the process. And then one area that we identified that there's a need specifically for research in terms of African vultures is in terms of the threat of the heavy metal lead. So Linda van der Heever, and you can see on this picture on the slide, Linda has been studying and doing scientific research on white-backed and Cape vultures specifically, showing elevated levels of lead in these species. And her research at Dronfield in the Northern Cape has also shown it's pinpointed lead ammunition as the source, the lead source within these birds. So Linda represents BirdLife South Africa on the Department of Environment's National Lead Task Team, and they're working on strategies and a long-term plan how to move from lead ammunition to non-toxic alternatives. Apart from working specifically on the threat of lead, we're also implementing vulture safe zones in Africa. So vulture safe zones was first implemented in Asia very successfully just to deal with the single threat of diclofenac. It was included in a 2017 multi-species action plan that was published for the conservation of African Eurasian vultures. And here we are looking at protecting large pieces, so large stretches of land, and making them threat-free for our vultures. Now, the first question that might pop up is that these vultures cross international borders. They traverse very large areas of land just in one day. But by having large areas, that's important foraging areas for these birds, threat-free, is making those areas safe for the birds, as well as providing them with safe breeding areas. We cannot do this work on our own, so this is a big collaborative project with a number of partners, starting the implementation in Southern Africa, and the plan is to extend that to the rest of Africa. And then I'd like to just move on from vultures to a very small species, white-winged flufftail, and we'll be hosting another webinar on the 7th of July, specifically talking about the conservation of this species. It's a wetland species. It's elusive, small little bird, about 25 grams in weight, but it's listed as critically endangered by the IUCN. And it's estimated that there's only about 250 birds that's remaining in the wild. So the white-winged flufftails occur in Ethiopia and in South Africa. And when I started with working on this project about 9 years ago now, at that stage we thought the birds are actually migrating to South Africa. So they're overwintering here in our summer, and the only known breeding habitat that we were aware of was Burger wetland in Ethiopia. So with such threat, specifically a threat of overgrazing to the habitat in Ethiopia and such a small number of birds left, we realized that time is running out for the white-winged flufftail, and the best we could do is to protect the habitat in Ethiopia as well as in South Africa. But to do proper habitat protection, we needed to understand more about the species. So we needed to understand the actual habitat requirements of the species to produce a species habitat management guideline. So Robin Culane and Alistair Campbell showed here on this photograph started the camera trapping project purely just to understand more about the species in South African wetlands. Once we finally recorded white-winged flufftails on the camera trapping in wetlands are not that simple, we managed to actually not only learn more about the habitat requirements, but we recorded a first breeding record for the species in the Southern Hemisphere, making our habitat so much more important for the species. We also recorded the call, which was unknown up to the time, of the white-winged flufftail through our camera trapping and acoustic survey work. So this is a typical example of a project where we started where we had little information, where through our scientific research, we've managed to answer some questions and we've managed to translate that into best practice. So we now have a best practice guidelines for the management of the habitat of the species. And we can use white-winged flufftails as a flagship species for wetland conservation. And through the support of rock jumper birding tours, we're able to have a full-time position working on this species. So equally important to protecting the species is to protect the habitats for those species. So looking at the protecting of ecosystems, we're contributing to the conservation estate specifically through biodiversity stewardship. So biodiversity stewardship is engaging with landowners, private landowners or communal landowners when an agreement is signed between the government and the landowner and they manage their land according to a management plan. The beauty of this is that this is inclusive, so farming practices, as an example, continue on this land, as conservation in Africa is often labeled as exclusive. So a wonderful way to contribute to protected areas and formally protected areas. And here I'd just like to highlight our contributions specifically in the high altitude grasslands, then also in the mistbelt grasslands, as well as the mistbelt forests, and then in the Western Capes, our specific focus on estuaries. And we're also thankful we're doing specifically our work in the mistbelt grasslands and mistbelt forests in collaboration with another NGO, Conservation Outcomes. So I've got a couple of pictures here of some of the estuary work that's undertaken by Giselle Morrison in the Western Cape. And again, all of this work is undertaken through strategic partnerships with many other organizations. And just as important as it is to safeguard these habitats through formal protection, there's often developments that threaten these habitats, also specifically our high altitude grassland as well as wetland habitats. Got a number of coal mines that's proposed in these areas. So we do reactive engagement or casework through our policy and advocacy program. This photograph here is of Dr. Melissa Lewis. She's an environmental lawyer. Melissa joined us on the 1st of May as the head of our policy and advocacy program. And the focus on this program is not only on casework, but also on policy development. And much of that policy development is done in collaboration with government, with the South African National Biodiversity Institute, as well as with the Department of Environment, where we focus on development of best practice guidelines. So our next program is the Regional Conservation Program, and that's headed up by Daniel Marnewick. And I'm going to hand over to Daniel to talk more about the work that himself and Simi Bazeng, Dr. Simi Bazeng, that's on this photograph here with Daniel, is doing beyond the borders of South Africa.
Thank you, Hanneline, and good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Hanneline, if you could change to the next slide. Just to give some context to why it is so important that we work across our borders in the rest of Africa, and this in part is answering a question that Kish Shetty has posed. Because birds don't respect borders, basically, and they migrate, they move great distances, and so we need to conserve really vast landscapes and migratory routes and habitat stepping stones in order to effectively conserve our birds. So that's one reason. And so our regional program, which is a new program formed at the beginning of this year, as Hanneline said, and currently it's got 3 staff members. We're looking to employ a 4th fairly soon. Our remit is to work with other African countries and assist them as much as possible to conserve their birds, either conserving species, but mostly conserving the most important sites and habitats for those species. So just to give a little bit of context, South Africa, as you may or may not know, is really in a strong position when it comes to knowing where our biodiversity is, where the most important places are for species and habitats, where our threatened species are found. We've basically, through our expert scientists that we have in this country, we've mapped our biodiversity wall to wall, corner to corner. It's referred to, the map is referred to as salad bowl, because it really is. There isn't a part of the country that hasn't been unmapped. What that means is we know where the most important places are, and we're able to direct our protected area expansion to those places. We've also got one of the most advanced programs on important bird and biodiversity areas. But that's fairly unique in Africa. While South Africa is a world leader, other African countries are not in the same position. In fact, some of them haven't mapped their biodiversity. They haven't even listed all of their threatened species. So they've got very little to go on. And the purpose of our program is to share some of our knowledge and expertise and support those other African countries. If you can change slides, Hanneline. So 2 global standards that we have used. The first is the red list, which Hanneline has shown that we were instrumental in producing the red list of threatened birds. And you get red lists for all the taxonomic groups in the world. And the red list is about identifying those species that are threatened at various levels, from vulnerable to critically endangered. And obviously a part of that is mapping where those threatened species and ecosystems occur. That data is then fed into another global standard called key biodiversity areas. And these are sites that contribute significantly to the global persistence of biodiversity, whether it's terrestrial, freshwater, or marine. And in effect, it's taking that information from the red list and it's saying this site is the most important for biodiversity, and developing a network of those sites. And because this is a global standard, it can be applied by any country, as is the red list. So South Africa is a leader in that as well. The KBA, or Key Biodiversity Areas Standard, was published in 2016, and we have been one of the first countries to really embrace it and do a complete national review to identify KBAs in our landscapes. And That's a process that's actually coming to a conclusion fairly soon, and hopefully later on in this year, we will be able to present that network to you. Next slide, Hanneline. So why is this important for African countries? So I apologize for this horrendogram, but just to summarize it, there are 6 really important outcomes from identifying places like key biodiversity areas. Firstly, it tells you where your most important sites are for conserving biodiversity, so it prioritizes sites for biodiversity. With that, you can then develop a strategy for where you want to place your protected areas. So long gone are the days 100 years ago where they used to randomly put up a fence and declare it a protected area because of some political interest. Nowadays, to get bang for our buck, with the limited resources we have to make sure that we're establishing protected areas in the most important places, and KBAs can tell us that. It's also meant to guide development planning. So just to give you an idea, they say by 2030, Africa will have 90% of the poorest people in the world on our continent. With that is going to be a big need for economic development in African countries to deal with that level of poverty. And with economic development comes massive infrastructure development. So we need to be ready as a continent to be able to guide that development away from the most important places for biodiversity. We can't do that if we don't know where those sites are and we haven't mapped it. So this is really about African countries being able to guide that process. And it's an urgent issue because, as we know, especially China is coming into Africa and they are removing natural resources, and African countries at the moment don't have the knowledge to guide them away from the most sensitive places. And knowing where your key biodiversity areas are also helps you to report on your biodiversity. So like Hanneline presented earlier, South Africa has published a national report on our national biodiversity, and a lot of African countries don't do that. So knowing where your KBAs are helps with that. And also a lot of international funders are directing funding towards places that are internationally important, like KBAs. And ultimately, if you can achieve all of that, you are going to achieve the safeguarding of these sites, which will also help reverse the threat status of a lot of these species. Next slide, Hanneline. So just to focus in on the KBA program, this is an international standard. It's supported by 13 of the world's biggest conservation NGOs with a fairly big, rigorous international structure. But I just want to focus down on the bottom right corner and point out that while this is an international program with all these international NGOs, it's really designed that these KBAs are identified from the bottom up. So it's about setting up national structures like national coordination groups with national experts and national government partners who identify these KBAs. And they in turn are supported by a broader KBA community of practice. So that's trying to bring together all the different countries, all the experts to share their expertise and knowledge. And through that bottom-up process of identifying KBAs, that then goes up to a KBA secretariat in the UK who receives these KBA proposals and publishes them online and makes them available for everyone to see. So what we are facilitating as BirdLife South Africa is we are working with African countries to help them set up these national coordination groups and take ownership of this process by developing local capacity, local institutional knowledge to really drive the KBA process at a national level. And BirdLife South Africa is in the fortunate position that we are the chair, or I'm the chair of the KBA community globally. I'm also the African representative, and I'm the regional focal point. So African countries have to come to us to help them with identifying their key biodiversity areas. Next slide. So this is just a slide about the KBA community, and this is how we got involved in KBAs initially. And this community is designed to provide a platform for the larger community of practice globally to engage in this process. And the uptake has been phenomenal, and there's a number of reasons for that. Partly because this is a global standard, so it's become the global currency for biodiversity, but also all the countries that are signatories to international agreements like the Convention on Biological Diversity are going to have to report on their KBAs, and so they need a rigorous network of KBAs. But yeah, that's just what the community tries to achieve by setting up this platform. Next slide. So with my colleague, Dr. Simi Bazeng, who you saw in the photo, he manages a project called BASPA, which is Biodiversity Assessments for Spatial Prioritization in Africa. And then in my role as the KBA chair, we've been working with a number of countries to help them kickstart their KBA programs. And you can see the countries highlighted there are the ones that have shown particular interest. The countries in green are those that have set up national coordination groups. And the countries in orange are those who have shown interest and are starting to raise the money and local capacity to do that. Then South Africa, Mozambique, and Uganda are 3 African countries who have actually undertaken and about to complete national reviews of their KBAs. And there are a couple of other countries like Kenya and Madagascar who are starting the process as well. So as you can see, we're supporting a large number of African countries at one level or another to identify their KBAs. And then we have other global tools that we are using to help them develop mechanisms to safeguard those sites. We're also involved in a program called EFI, which is the East Atlantic Flyway Initiative. And that's in partnership with the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. And that aims to protect flyways around the western horn of Africa or along the East Atlantic to develop a network of sites that support the migration of those species. Next slide, Hanneline. I think this is the last one. Yeah, that's the last one. So that's really what the regional program is busy with. While the program is new, we've really been doing this work, myself and Bazeng, for the last 3 years now or so. And unfortunately, it's not easy to raise money for this type of work. People are more interested in the more attractive projects, but hopefully you understand how critically important this is. And without this knowledge, it becomes very difficult for African countries to prioritize what they protect and how they protect it. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. So the fifth of our conservation programs that we'll discuss is our Science and Innovation program. And that's headed up by Robin Kulain at the top there. And also within this program is Aaron Sotif and Nolo Kamagu supporting Robin in his role. And it's an interesting question. Why do we have a in-house science team? And it's really to answer those most pertinent research questions that we need to have answered relatively fast too, because time is not on our side, to implement conservation action. Just like to highlight one of those projects tonight, and that is the Conservation Modeling Project. So this team has been working quite hard, even in lockdown, on species distribution models that's been created for 96 threatened species. And the species distribution models, it's our contribution directly into the National Department's National Site Screening Tool. And the importance of this is that all avifaunal specialists and developers, when they want to do a site selection or site screening before development is even considered, they would visit that national site screening tool and see how sensitive the area is in terms of a number of taxa and then specifically in terms of the bird species that's occurring there. We're also developing microhabitat suitability models. So these models are specifically for our endemic species and our habitat specialists. And on top of that, we're adding, and in the process of adding, land use and climate change models to identify those core climate resilient areas So to identify the core ecosystems that we need to protect. And this is an example here. I'm showing an example of the grasslands, and I'm showing bird species, which I know you all easily identify. So there's russlark, whittleslark, and also yellow-breasted pipit. And the map showed there is microhabitat suitability models for yellow-breasted pipit. But we're also doing this for the fynbos biome as well as for the forest biome. And the results of all of this and the output of this will feed directly into spatial planning and also habitat protection for South Africa. So I think at this stage, I've hopefully convinced you all that the work that we're doing is really important in terms of protecting ecosystems as well as the services that those ecosystems provide to humans and to biodiversity. So birds are important ecosystem indicators, so they're the proverbial canaries in the coal mine, but they're equally important for our mental health and for leisure, and just so many of us just enjoy to watch birds. So in 2010, the Department of Trade of Industry has estimated the contribution of aviatourism to be around 2 billion rand annually, and that must have grown by now. And also what's important to just highlight here is that aviatourism is important in all areas. It's not only limited to big 5 areas. So it's an important contribution to our rural communities in terms of income. So BirdLife South Africa has trained about 200 community bird guides, and more than 50 of those guides are making a living as professional bird guides. And those guides, as well as many others that's been trained by us, are still involved in conservation and environmental education projects within their communities. And that makes our footprint even so much bigger. And we've now established a full aviatourism project. So we've recently appointed Andrew de Blok there, shown on the far right. And Andrew's going to be heading up the aviatourism project. And Andrew will be sharing in another webinar all our new ideas for this project, and specifically how we will be supporting our community bird guides. And in this time, and with economic recovery, specifically with the tourism industry that's plummeted through the impacts of COVID-19 during the lockdown, we will be focusing on domestic tourism, marketing domestic tourism, also working with our birder-friendly establishment and bird tour operators. And we raised funds for our community bird guides during this time that they have no income. And this will allow us to support these guides for the next couple of months to come. So from all of them, a thank you to all of you who contributed so generously to this Community Bird Guide Relief Fund. And this was also my last slide, so also a big thank you from me for listening and for your support to BirdLife South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hanneline. So I really am amazed at the diverse work that BirdLife South Africa is involved in. It is absolutely incredible and really wonderful to have it all put together in such a concise way. I know there's a hell of a lot that we didn't get to share tonight, but I encourage everyone to go and explore our website to see just all of the intricate elements to the work that we do. I'd like to thank Daniel, Hanneline, and Alistair for that really, really interesting presentation. And before we take questions, please just remember that you can support the production of these webinars using the QR code on your screen, or you can also visit the Cricket website link that is in the bottom right-hand side of your screen. As you exit the webinar, please remember that you'll be directed to a short survey. Please take 2 minutes just to complete this. It really does help us continue to improve these webinars, and it allows us to get a little bit of feedback from all of you. Next week, you're in for a special session, as I said earlier. It's one that we're going to try and entice all of our golfing enthusiasts with. CEO Mark Anderson is going to be interviewing 2 of South Africa's golfing greats, Mark McNulty and Tony Johnston. So please don't miss that. And if you do know any golfing enthusiasts, please let them know and get them to register via our Conservation Conversations website. All right, so without further ado, let's tackle some of those questions. And remember that you can upvote any that you would like answered. So starting off, Daniel, with you, we had a question from both Penny Abbott and Arno Elmer asking why Namibia is not part of the KBA community. Could you please shed some light on that for us?
Sure. So the KBA community is just a platform for people to engage, and there are Namibian organizations that are a part of that. But the reason that they're not on that map is because at this stage they're not engaging in identifying key biodiversity areas. It's partly maybe because there's not a BirdLife country partner there right now to engage with. They haven't shown particular interest in key biodiversity areas. I think they are fairly well mapped in terms of the most important places. Namibia is not necessarily biologically diverse or important, but they are very important, particularly their coastline for migratory species. So while they're not interested in KBAs, they have shown interest in using other mechanisms that we are working with, global mechanisms like conservation areas, to get those sites globally recognized and better protected in the country.
Great, thanks, Daniel. Now, Hanneline, this one's coming at you, and I see it's got 11 votes, so lots of people are interested. Eleanor Mary's asked whether or not anyone can hear the call of the white-winged flufftail, please. Would you like to elaborate as to why we withheld that call?
Yes, definitely. Thanks, Eleanor Mary, for this question. Specifically, white-winged flufftail call, there's reasons for us not sharing this call, and it's because it's just so sensitive. So it's a critically endangered species. Most of our recordings are related specifically to the breeding season of a bird. So we have to be really careful. And at this stage, the decision has been taken that we will use the call for scientific purposes. So in other words, we could do calls to do playback calls and see if the birds are actually responding. But we can't release the call to the public at this stage. In terms of dealing with a critically endangered species and playing the call during the breeding season, we don't know what that impact will be on our birds.
Thanks, Hanneline. And certainly we know it is frustrating for our birders not being able to get their hands on that call, but we hope that they'll respect the decision we've made to try and protect this bird. We know there are fewer than 250 individuals left, so we really don't want to have any negative impacts on them. Now, Peter Buerta is asking how BirdLife South Africa is addressing climate change impacts in its conservation work. I think, Hanneline, if you can start with this, and Alistair, please feel free to chip in on the seabird front once Hanneline's addressed the land bird side.
Sure, thanks, Melissa. So our climate change work, and we're talking about this on a daily basis, is built into our conservation modeling. So it's within the pipeline that we'll be adding climate change layers to all our species distribution models, and be looking at how will climate change actually impact on the actual habitat that's available for that species, where that species will occur in 20 years from now, to make sure that when we focus our habitat protection, that we actually focus it on the areas where it's completely climate resilient, and we know that we're securing a future for the species. Alistair, you're welcome to add there from the seabird side.
Thanks, Hanneline. Yeah, that's quite an important question. Actually, one of the most important questions facing a lot of taxa, including seabirds, and a very difficult one to answer. From our side, one of the things we can do to adapt to climate change is to hedge our bets in terms of where we look at where will the prey for these seabird species likely be under various climate change scenarios. So one of the projects that we're involved with, which Christina Hagen is spearheading, is the location of new artificial penguin colonies in areas where they can't naturally breed because there's no islands free from predators. But it is an area where a lot of the pelagic baitfish of South Africa's west coast have generally shifted over the years, and this has been predicted to have been influenced by climate change. So if we can set up colonies in areas where the fish are likely to be in the future, then we have a greater chance of ensuring the conservation of those species.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks, Hanneline. Definitely, climate change is the big bad wolf looming, and it's something that we all need to start taking very seriously going forward. And I'm very pleased to see that BirdLife is incorporating climate change into more and more of what we do. So keep watching this space. And I know our colleague Robin Cullen, who's doing a lot of really fascinating modeling, which Hanneline briefly shared with you there, will hopefully be giving us a really informative webinar somewhere down the line into some of the impacts that climate change is likely to have on a lot of our birds distributions going forward. Now, Arno Peterson asked the question, how many Cape vultures are there in our 2 provinces, specifically the Lowveld and Limpopo? Lowveld, I assume you're meaning in Mpumalanga, Arno. And our CEO, Mark Anderson, has very kindly offered an answer there for you, Arno. So he says there's just around just under 3,000 pairs of Cape vultures across those 2 provinces. And those mainly occur at 3 colonies, which are the Kransberg, Blouberg, and Manutswa colonies. So Arno, that's your answer, just under 3,000 pairs in those 2 provinces. Now, Alistair, this one's for you. Eddie is asking, is the mouse eradication program for Marion Island taking place this year?
Short answer there, no. The mouse eradication on Marion Island was actually earmarked. It has shifted along the line in recent years, but now with the COVID crisis upon us, we're waiting for a response by government to see where we stand with that, because the Goth eradication has now been postponed till next year, and that's affected the Marion eradication because they both use similar government resources. So we're in regular engagement with them. We're waiting an answer, and we have already got a bunch of contingency plans set up to keep the momentum going with Marion, because we obviously realize that's a critical conservation project for a lot of those threatened albatross and petrel species affected by these mice.
Absolutely, and we look forward to when they can get back on track as soon as we can get through this COVID storm. Thanks, Al. Now, our great friend and colleague, Kishalan Chetty from Eskom's put up a question which, Hanneline, I think you can tackle. What role does BirdLife South Africa see industry playing within the conservation of avifauna in South Africa, and in brackets across Africa, particularly regarding the securing of IBAs under formal conservation protection?
Great, thanks Kish, and Kish is a really good friend to our organization, so thank you Kish for this question. And we really value our partnerships with industry too, and I think my answer is twofold. So I'm going to start with a more indirect answer, which is specifically supporting us, so indirect support, and a good example is our work that we're doing with the Ngula Partnership on the border of KwaZulu-Natal and the Free State. We're working on a biodiversity stewardship area together where we'll be formally protecting that habitat and working with landowners. So that's indirect support through Eskom and through the Ngula Partnership. So through the funding and support, we can do so much more together. But there's also the direct link, and some of these industry developments can actually implement management plans where they are developed. And Ngula is another example. So that's a pump storage scheme that was developed specifically. Part of it is in the Free State, part of it is in KwaZulu-Natal. That area was one of the known white-winged flufftail habitats, but through conservation, we have now, and working together, we have now protected that as a nature reserve, and the area is conserved into the future, and the actual management on site is much better than it was before Eskom started to work on the site. So it's a great example of how industry can contribute to sustainable development.
Thanks, Hanneline, and thanks, Kish, for that important question. Alistair, this one's for you. What is happening with the new penguin colony that was being started where you'd put the models out? So I think this is speaking towards Christina's work and the webinar she gave. Do you have an update for us on that project at the moment?
Yes, thanks Jane for that question. Yes, so as Melissa said, that's a project that Christina has initiated and is involved in. And that project is up and running. All the infrastructure's in. The social attraction devices like these models and the audio are up and running. There's a predator-proof fence that's currently operational that's being monitored by CCTV cameras. So everything's waiting and ready. It's just a bit of a waiting game at the moment. And another thing that Christina is doing in collaboration with Sandcob is to prepare them for the release of captive reared fledglings, juvenile penguins, to bolster the potential for recruitment to that site once those birds become breeding adults. So we know there's a lot of fish out at De Hoop. It's definitely in the perfect place. There's no competition from purseine fishing. So we're holding thumbs that it will just naturally colonize within the next few years.
Thanks, Alistair. Now, Eileen Morrison's asking, tourism in South Africa has been aimed at overseas tourists, specifically pricing a lot of our lodges out of the range of some local tourists. Do you think there's going to be a push for the local tourism front to start easing some of their prices, particularly speaking towards the likes of Sand Parks accommodation, which has become very expensive? Hanneline, I don't know if you'd like to speak to this topic a little bit.
I can definitely try. It's a difficult question, Eileen. I think it's out of our hands to answer whether the prices would be lowered to encourage local tourism. What we as a conservation organization is definitely going to encourage is to market domestic and local tourism. And the beauty also of AV-tourism is that it could be within sort of your home patch, and you don't need to cross provincial boundaries. So our contribution will definitely be a focus on getting the domestic tourism market going as fast as what we can. But whether the lodges will drop their prices, yeah, I think that's out of my hands to actually answer that one. Thanks.
Thanks, Hanneline. Yes, definitely not quite our forte, but hopefully it is an idea that could potentially help spur a bit more local industry going forward. So we'll have to watch this space and see where this COVID wave takes us going forward. Now, the last question that's sitting in the Q&A box at the moment is from Gladwell. And Gladwell's asking, I've recently noticed that the common miners I used to see in the Centurion area have now almost disappeared. Is this common? Now, firstly, Gladwell, I'd like to say that this is one of the first reports I've heard of common miners disappearing. We typically hear of them starting to invade and turning up in new areas. So that is a very interesting observation. And I'm sure if anyone would like to comment on that in the chat box, you're welcome to. I don't know of any commonality in terms of common miners disappearing over South Africa. Last week in our Kruger talk, we had some discussion around them popping up in new parts of Kruger Park, so expanding their range. But a very interesting observation, and certainly something that we'd like people to keep an eye on and report when you do see those invasive species, the likes of common miners, rose-ring parakeets, and some of the other invasives we keep records on. So with that, I think that looks like all the questions that we have tonight. Lots of well done and congrats coming through to all of our speakers. So I'd just like to thank Hanneline, Daniel, and Alistair once again for their hard work and their really great presentation this evening. I think you guys did BirdLife proud and really helped showcase the very big diversity of work that we're involved in. So well done to the three of you. Please remember to tune in next week if you are a golfing enthusiast. It's going to be all things birdies, eagles, and albatrosses, and definitely one that is not to be missed. Thank you all for the support and for tuning in with us tonight. Have a safe evening. Take care of yourselves. I see they've just released the level 3 lockdown regulations, so go and have a read of those, and it looks like wine and beer will be back on sale soon. So I'm sure many of you will be looking forward to that. Take care, everyone. Have a safe evening. Have a safe week. We'll see you again next week. Keep your eyes outside and on the skies and enjoy those birds. I'll chat to you in a week's time. Good night, everyone.